Welcome back, fellow football fanatics. It is College Football with Sam, and we are here with Joe DeLeon of the Ruffino and Joe Show. You may know them from their 3 to 4 time a week live show that goes on every week, and the fact that they're always engaging. They cover all the different teams in college football. They've even gotten to several Group of 5 schools, which, as Corn Crazed would say, shows that they are true in-depth college football fans. How are you doing, Joe?
I'm doing good, and as you said, definitely crazed. And I chalk up having to do the G5 previews like we did. Obviously, we need to now know who the best G5 teams are. That's something that's never been on a radar before, but we've run out of things to talk about. We've talked about everything this whole offseason, and I was saying to you before we went live that, man, I just need some ball. I just need some ball to kick off. We're so close.
Yeah, I'm waiting for Florida State, Georgia Tech. I cannot wait for that to happen August 24th at noon. I'm so excited.
It's going to be a great game. And it's not the sexiest matchup, but and that whole slate, I'm kind of disappointed that we don't have a better Week 0 slate. I think like the other games like Montana State. I'm a former FCS player, so seeing Montana State play is kind of fun for me, but there's just so many weird matchups. That Georgia Tech Florida State game, though, like you said, it's college football. It'll be fun to see if DJU can take that offense to the level that Florida State fans are expecting, but it should be a great game.
Absolutely, it should be a great game. Who do you think is the best team in college football right now?
For me, I keep coming back to Georgia, and I understand that a lot of folks want to push for Ohio State to be better than Georgia. They're right behind them. They're just a small, slight step for one important reason, and that's quarterback. I look at Georgia the way that this team is bringing back a lot on their defensive lines. Michael Williams, albeit didn't take the step forward that we were hoping for in his production. I think this year is going to be huge for him. Third year as a full-time starter. Their linebacking core, C.J. Allen, was a bright spot for them at linebacker. And then Malachi Starks is an unbelievable safety. One of the most unreal prospects that I've had the opportunity to evaluate. Their offensive line's mean. I know that Amarius Mims left for the NFL, but he barely played last year. So they're bringing in this grouping, same one back, led by Tate Ratledge, who's the best, in my opinion, of the bunch. But the most important thing, as I just said, is quarterback. Carson Beck having a full year under his belt, but more importantly, having faced off in the SEC without your top weapons in Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey for parts of the season last year, really no receivers compared to the group that they brought in through the transfer portal this offseason. Everything he was able to accomplish in 2023 makes me feel extremely optimistic that he's going to only improve and that this offense is going to be even more formidable. Again, without weapons that they needed often, they were still statistically one of the best in the country. Yeah. It's not saying that Ohio State isn't freakish and isn't very gifted and deep, but I need to see Will Howard. I need to see what he does in the Big Ten.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair, especially given Ohio State's questions at offensive line as well compared to Georgia. You have, I would argue, 3 guards who are all SEC caliber at Georgia. You have Tate Ratledge, as you mentioned, and then you have Dylan Fairchild, and I forget who the other guard is, but there's
Xavier Truss. Is that who you're talking about? Who's kind of played that swing guard tackle position, and Ernest Green's who's their left tackle, who's been projected a little bit as a guard in the NFL. But you're right. There's just so many names that we could bring up.
Exactly. And then I think Oscar Delp at tight end, while not as good as Brock Bowers, I think that he'll fill in that position rather nicely. Defensively, though, they had some issues last year, particularly in the run defense, where they were outside of the top 25 in a few categories, including yards allowed per carry. Do you think with the return of Brinson and Stackhouse, Munden Jr. at linebacker, do you think all of that will kind of work out, especially given Kirby Smart's pedigree?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And they were dealing with injuries at linebacker last year, and it kind of felt like they were trying to figure out what direction that they were going in. C.J. Allen, I think, is really important for their success because he started to come on hot down the stretch. He was a true freshman last year. He's only going to improve. But I'm less worried about that. It just really felt like that they were trying to transition from having Jalen Carter and having these just premier ridiculous guys in the middle, and then going on to figure out like who is that next guy. They don't have that premier player in the middle just right now, but I think that this group of sophomores that didn't get onto the field just yet, there's going to be a name that comes out of it. That 2023, I think, recruiting class, it was really loaded. The one guy in particular that I'm excited to see is Jordan Hall, who was very, very highly coveted that year.
Yeah, I think that their defense will improve from last year, just given all the returning starters, returning 2D players. Secondary, I think there may be some signs of weakness, but Malachi Starks and Dalen Everett should have great seasons. A lot of people, though, have pointed to their schedule for being one of the toughest in the country, and maybe that could wear them down. But I think that their depth is such that they'll power through it. And I think that they are significantly better than Texas, than Ole Miss. I think they have the depth to, especially by the end of the year, be better than Alabama. And as for Kentucky or Auburn or anyone else who plays them on their schedule, including Georgia Tech and Clemson, I again still think that they're better, deeper, better coached, just in every way. Is it wrong for me to say I have a hard time seeing anyone else win it all except for this team?
I don't think so. I think that at the very least you could at least put Ohio State into the conversation. But, I mean, we've seen it happen on the field already. We've seen this story already where coming into the year, the hype is building, they've got momentum, and then it plays out on the field. They're one of the few times, I think, in college football with a dynasty, because that's what this is right now, with a dynasty, that they are actually backing up the hype. It is at that level, and there's reasons why Kirby Smart gets this comparison to Nick Saban on the trajectory that he's on, is because those Alabama teams, when they were hyped up to win national championships, they usually lived up to it. Other programs can't do that. Other programs can't say that. Think about all the times that Ohio State was hyped up, Notre Dame was hyped up, Oklahoma was hyped up. Something always happened. They always seemingly fell short. But I don't think it's wrong to, because we've seen it actually come to fruition on a consistent basis. And then the bigger part for me, then whenever this whole offseason I've done guest appearances and I've been asked about who's going to win certain conferences, who's going to exceed expectations, who's going to perform better, whatever it might be, the most important thing that I always point out is quarterback play. Having guys who are experienced, who've played a ton of snaps, who've been around for a long time, are always going to be an advantage. And having Carson Beck, who's already been there in Bobo's offense, is only going to continue to pay dividends for them.
Okay. Thank you for your opinion on that. Sorry for a little bit of the awkwardness. There's just apparently an audio issue that we're encountering, but I think I fixed it. I think it was my new camera, I think, has audio on it, and that was running. Let me just make sure everything's fine. There. I think that'll be better. Okay. Thank you for your patience, everyone. Let me know if it's better, if it's worse. We're still building the studio here, but if you can't tell already,
I've been there.
If you can't tell already, we have like a 4K camera in use that I tried to get my hands on and stuff. Okay, awesome. Everyone says it's fixed, so we'll move on. Yeah, I think Georgia is the best team in the country. I don't think there is much that's more obvious than it's their year, and if they don't win it, I would say it's a disappointment, because they're built with their depth at O-line, with all their talent at, quarterback or even wide receiver. They've recruited well at tight end, and as you said, that massive class on defense in 2021 or 2022, and the players they have at secondary, all American caliber players, they're built to outlast every other team in college football. And especially when you have Carson Beck, who's a future NFL quarterback, you have to take advantage of it now. Taking advantage of situations is an important part of being a great team in college football. Michigan last year took advantage of NIL to bring back multiple starters who could have went to the NFL, and all of them would have been picked on day 2, day 3, maybe even some day 1. But they brought all of them back, and they used their experience to win the national championship. And the Big Ten brought in USC, UCLA, Oregon, and Washington, taking advantage of the chaos that was the Pac-12. And the SEC did the same thing with Texas and Oklahoma. What I want to know from you, because I only have one perspective and one set of eyes, is where do you see conference realignment going next? Are we in another decade lull, like after Nebraska, Rutgers, and Maryland moved to the Big Ten, and Missouri and A&M went to the SEC, that things just were on the down low and a pause for about a decade? Or is this just, once again, the calm before the storm, and we're going to see Florida State, Miami, Clemson, Notre Dame, and other schools mark their exodus to new conferences?
Yeah, personally, right now, I think that we're going to be in that lull. I think that we're at a little bit of a stopping point because what right now we're seeing happen with the ACC is painting that picture is that there's just so many hurdles in the way for there to be an immediate departure. I know that there is an out or a potential look in that ESPN contract in the next few years, but that's still not completely imminent. I also don't think that they're going to have the money right this second. But what is going to be the biggest catalyst for any movement is if any of those programs in the ACC, I don't even think it has to be Florida State or Clemson or a team like North Carolina. If one of those teams decides to go the private equity route and said private equity firm or whoever might decide to invest in any of these football programs, which is going to come a lot sooner than I think people realize. If that does come sooner, and they're willing to foot the bill to remove a team from a conference, and they're going to be aggressive in trying to relocate them, I think that is going to be what will eventually lead to the downfall of another conference. I don't think it's going to be the Big 12 because I think the Big 12 has actually positioned themselves very nicely with the size of the conference,
Yes.
the regionality where it's not too widespread, but it fits the right portions of the country. It's the most competitive that it has ever been. But if something does go down, it feels like it might end up being maybe more of a mid-tier ACC school instead of the ones that are taking all the attention from the top.
It's an interesting perspective for sure. From what I understand, Florida State and Clemson and these schools that have been trying to get out have not had any luck with the grant of rights. And it seems like they may indeed be stuck with the Big Ten and the SEC and even the Big 12 kind of leaving them behind. And the Big 12 being willing to sell their naming rights is huge because companies will want as much advertising as they can get. And the Big 12, with entertainment, with people like Josh Pate hyping them up, with the fact that Kansas is good, Iowa State is good, these schools that have traditionally been garbage are now somethings, that's going to draw a lot of eyeballs.
Yeah, the additional attention, I think the Big 12, that's the one thing that I think you framed it really great there is that Yormark is one of the more forward-thinking commissioners that I've seen. And the thing I love about him is he talks shit. I don't know if I'm allowed to curse or not, but he talks a lot of smack freely, very aggressively. We don't get the same thing from some of these other commissioners, especially like you look at Greg Sankey is just very, very tactile, very specific with his detailed wording on how he tries to answer questions. And Tony Petitti, we barely even hear the guy talk since he's taken this Big Ten job, but Yormark is not afraid to take shots. And I think he understands that because there's this entertainment value, he's got the partnership with the WWE, that if he plays it right and it kind of frames it as the Big 12 against the world, I think that there can be investment not only from those fan bases, but just from sports fans in general that are looking for a fun product to tune into. It doesn't need to live up to the SEC and the Big Ten hype of having unlimited 5 stars on the top teams in the conference. If you put out competitive, close football games, people will tune in.
Yeah, they will, just like they did with the WAC or the Mountain West. People even like the MAC. And then I might be wrong in saying this. Aren't they playing their championship game in Las Vegas? Did they work?
It is. It's in Raider Stadium. Yep.
Oh, that's very smart. Yeah, getting that area, the Las Vegas, Nevada area. They have the whole Mountain Time Zone, much of Central Time Zone. They're all over the place, and they're in Florida too.
Right.
And Cincinnati, and they got West Virginia, who has their own little niche. I think that they are in a good position to like you said, to be aggressive. They're not passive or totally on defense like the ACC is. Who do you think is going to be the first school, like the first domino that causes the domino effect and causes the house of cards to fall? Who's going to be the first school or one of the first to move?
I have a feeling it's going to be North Carolina before it ends up being. I don't have sourcing on this to before anyone tries to to get it run with, but North Carolina makes the most sense to me because we've heard is that none of these conferences are really super excited to go after and bring in Florida State or Clemson. There's been, I mean, even very direct answers from Greg Sankey saying that he has no intention of adding Florida State into the mix. But North Carolina presents, I think, a far more compelling brand for either of those entities, the Big Ten or the SEC, if they were to add them, because of their presence at basketball and then all of the other sports. If that does end up becoming a priority, they've got a great baseball program. Football's been competitive enough and they've recruited well enough in that region that if you bring them into the conference, they'll be in the middle of the pack. Maybe they'll dip a little bit lower. But if you get another Kentucky type team that's great at basketball and kind of towards the middle and gets a lot of financial investment from a rabid fan base, that's huge. Florida State doesn't present that same advantage. It's really football and baseball. Their basketball team has been very inconsistent. Clemson definitely does not have a good basketball program. So I think that the decision-making for growing these conferences, people forget sometimes that football is not the only sport and that if there is growth, they might look in other directions. And the last part of this is it's a great academic school. I know that sometimes doesn't really sell tickets, but to maybe raise the standard of the conference to have a school like UNC that does as well as it does academically.
Especially for the Big Ten, I think that's a big factor. It's the same with Miami. I did find it strange that Florida State and Clemson were kind of just pushed to the side by Greg Sankey and he declined interest. I can't see why you wouldn't want at least Florida State, given the fact that they're in Florida and their history in the 21st century and how successful they've been, and the fact that I think Norvell is on the up. But that's just me. That's just my perspective. I'm not Greg Sankey.
Well, I think the one thing with that is, and I agree with you, it presents like a really good brand that's won national championships. It's got a huge fan base that's nationwide fan base. But he also has to listen to the members of the university, and he has to make those decisions, not the university, of the conference, and those presidents, those ADs, the decision-making has to come from their influence in a way. So Florida probably has no desire to add Florida State into the mix to help them to some degree.
Yeah, especially since I think that Florida understands that adding Florida State would only push them down in the hierarchy.
Right.
Because Florida State's way better than them right now. Same with Clemson, even with their issues. That's a good point by you. And with the Big Ten, it may just not. It may be so off geographically, like even more than the West Coast, and it may make far less sense academically to where they don't even want to do it. So, yeah, I guess that makes sense. Okay, so one of the reasons I brought you on here was to talk about Notre Dame. Because I know that you're a Notre Dame fan. I've seen Blake, I think, chastise you on the show for talking about Notre Dame in any positive way. But the reality is that they're a top 10 team right now. Notre Dame's a top 10 team entering 2024. And they're very talented. Freeman's upgraded the talent of the roster. And they have a very easy schedule this year. And Notre Dame has typically had some cupcake schedules, or at least an average schedule. The past 2 years are pretty tough with Ohio State. This could be an extremely easy schedule, depending on how good USC, Florida State, Georgia Tech, Louisville, and Texas A&M are. And all those teams could be average or above average at the best, and some terrible. So this is a huge opportunity for Notre Dame, in my opinion. What do you think the expectation for this team should be? I know pre-show we talked about how they could very much go 12-0, but do you think that's fair in year 3 and with some of the questions they have?
I think that right now, and it's difficult for Marcus Freeman, and it really sucks for him being third year ever as a head coach. This isn't Brian Kelly, who had been a head coach at Central Michigan and at Cincinnati before he took the job, landing and doing how well he did in his third year and beyond. The expectation is going to be high because there has been an aggressive investment this offseason in them taking the next step. And the moves that we saw them make, particularly bringing in Mike Denbrock to lead this offense as the new offensive coordinator. And many who know who Jaden Daniels is and the performance and the stats that he put up last year know that Denbrock is a great talent developer of quarterbacks and a great just offensive decision maker in general. Last year, offensively, Jared Parker was incredibly underwhelming. So to have a completely different style change and bringing him into the mix is huge. And then more importantly, Riley Leonard, who last year, many people forget this, Mel Kiper, a lot of people in NFL circles had Riley Leonard, the Duke quarterback, as a top 50 projected pick, as a top 5 quarterback in last year's class. And he started to look like it at the beginning of the year until he suffered the injury that he did. And then everybody suddenly forgot who he was and forgot his name. Now he's at Notre Dame. Now he has that Jaden Daniels offensive coordinator and Mike Denbrock helping him. He's a tremendous athlete. He's got a really live arm. I think he's going to be huge for this Notre Dame offense if he's perfectly healthy. But to answer your question on expectations, because of all of this, a lot of the defense coming back, it has to be to go at least 11-1. Their schedule is extremely favorable. They should dominate their way through this schedule. You mentioned some tough games that they've got, but Georgia Tech, they're a lot better than Georgia Tech. They're a lot better than Louisville this year, who brought in Tyler Shuck. And frankly, they should beat USC even on the road because of their uncertain quarterback situation. We're assuming that Miller Moss is going to be good based on the bowl game, but nobody knows that for absolute certainty. So 11-1, I think, has to be the expectation. And I'm sorry to say this, but Marcus Freeman, if you go 10-2 or lower, 9-3, that feels like a total letdown with this ability to have a huge season. And the last part on this is, I don't think that they get in the playoff if they go 10-2. I don't think that their schedule has enough difficult ranked opponents outside of Texas A&M, Florida State, and USC that if they go 1-2 in those difficult matchups, they will not have the resume to go to the playoff. And Notre Dame is supposed to be built for this college football playoff, considering Jack Swarbrick was one of the architects for it. So they have to get to the playoff, I think, at the very least.
Yeah, I think that that's very fair given the talent they have and the hires that they've made, the huge staff upgrades. Let's take a look at this. Shoot, didn't do that right. Let's take a look at this schedule, everyone. So at Texas A&M in week 1, hosting Northern Illinois week 2, at Purdue week 3, hosting Miami of Ohio, though, not Miami, Florida, week 4. Louisville in week 5, a bye in week 6. That's just some nice time to rest after that Louisville game. And then you have Northern Illinois and Miami of Ohio to cushion some tough matchups. Stanford in week 7, at Georgia Tech week 8, Navy in a neutral site week 9, another bye to prepare for a home game against Florida State in November. That's very advantageous. Week 12 is hosting Virginia. 13 is hosting a service academy. That's an automatic win. Week 14 is traveling at USC. I do think that the record for this team, just my personal opinion, and what you discussed with me pre-show, is probably going to be 10-2, 11-1. I think the floor would be 9-3, but I have a difficult time seeing that hit unless both Notre Dame disappoints and A&M, USC, Florida State are all humming close to their ceiling. And USC, I disagree a little bit with you about Miller Moss, but where I will give you credit is I don't know if that defense is going to be top 10 in year 1 of D'Anton Lynn like he had in year 1 at UCLA. Because Alex Grinch just broke that unit psychologically, physically. It may have even broken him spiritually. I don't know. They were trash last year. And their O-line wasn't good either. And all of their starting receivers are true sophomores. So there's a lot of questions there. But Notre Dame, I didn't know this, but they only bring back 53% of their production, 8 starters. But I think that with Howard Cross III, Riley Mills, with Jack Kaiser, Benjamin Morrison, Xavier Watts, I think with the depth they have and the recruiting and the conditioning and the coaching, I think the defense should be very good. And with Joe Rudolph, I mean, he knows how to develop offensive linemen. He's got better recruits and more talent now that he's at Notre Dame compared to Wisconsin. Mitchell Evans is back. I've heard from Pate that the receivers are looking good, apparently. I don't know whether I believe that or not, but I know you told me receivers are more of a question mark than a necessary weakness. So, yeah, I can see why people think there's a lot with this team, especially if Leonard's healthy. If he's healthy and Denbrock is able to push this offense to its maximum, to its zenith in year one, they can do a lot. Do you think those are the main questions, is Leonard's health and how quickly Denbrock can retool this offense?
I have a lot of faith that Denbrock's going to retool the offense quickly because he's got the shell of the pieces that he needs. And this receiver room you mentioned, it was already starting to look good. And Chris Mitchell is not going to be the premier number one guy, but the receiver that they brought in from FIU, who was one of the highest producing receivers in the country last year, he is a talent and a type of receiver that they've lacked, which is somebody to take the top off of a defense. I think that is going to be really important for them. I feel like, as you mentioned, the biggest question really does come down to what happens with Riley Leonard. He has already shown last year, and I know that it was brutal dealing with the foot ankle situation that he was trying to recover from. His health is going to be something that's brought up on a week-to-week basis. It seemed like he was a little slow to get back into the rhythm of things during the spring, and he seems fine now. But it really hurts them that Charles Jagasaw, who was supposed to be replacing Joe Alt, there were a lot of high expectations for him, a former highly recruited tackle prospect. He goes down with the pec injury. He's done for the season. Now they're reshuffling once again. I feel like they could find a quality replacement, but for week one, having to deal with Nick Scourton on that Texas A&M defensive line with potentially an inexperienced tackle, whoever they end up going with, it is a little bit daunting. I just hope that Riley Leonard doesn't take any bad hits in that game. If he stays healthy, though, his tools are exactly what Denbrock needs to produce a very explosive offense. They're not going to replicate what Jaden Daniels did last year, but they're still going to be one of the better offenses in the country if everything clicks the way that it appears it can.
Yeah. That's I think that's a pretty good assessment, and I know that the Jagasaw injury changed my view about that week one game a little bit. But then again, A&M has Jay Bateman as their defensive coordinator, and I don't think that he's one of the 10 best defensive coordinators in the country, and they are piecing together. I mean, honestly, they're kind of going through, I think, what Notre Dame is, but to perhaps a greater extent, because even though they return more production, a lot of that's factoring in incoming transfers. And incoming transfer production, I would say, is rarely going to be the same as actual raw returning production, especially early in the season, especially then. Yeah, I mean, all I can really say is they better be 11-1 and in the playoffs, because if you're 10-2, you're hoping that there are tons of upsets happening to everyone, and that in all your other 10 wins, you're just owning teams left and right. I think that something that'll surprise people this year, and this is partially from my own personal predictions, not necessarily anyone else's, I think that with the top heaviness in a lot of conferences and the unbalanced schedules, you're going to get more 11-1, 12-0 teams than perhaps you've ever seen in quite some time, with teams getting demoralized as the year goes on and turning into free wins for some of these bigger schools. And then whether it's Rutgers or Iowa, Missouri, or Ole Miss, on those schedules, you just have one or two games. They're like Notre Dame schedules. You only have one or two games that if things just go right on an average basis, not everything going right, but just things go well, you should win all of those games and just have to play that 1 or 2 games that'll be tough. And that's even factoring in upsets. I mean, for Notre Dame, who's going to beat them from what we know preseason other than maybe A&M or Florida State at home, or if everything goes right, USC on the road, and they'll probably win at least one of those games because of all the question marks those teams have.
Yeah, no, I totally agree, though, with that last point that you have there. I think that there will be – it's going to be weird. There's going to be a lot of 10-2 teams. There's a lot of teams with favorable schedules, and there's a lot of Death Star quality teams at the top as well.
Bingo.
So that it could be a tough draw for the committee to try and figure out who ends up being those last ones to make it into the playoff.
Yeah. In conclusion, everyone, Notre Dame's defense is going to be awesome. They may have some holes, and I think that's because I don't know if Al Golden, like how great of a coordinator he is, just because of the talent he's had. Their defense has had, at times, massive gaping holes in some games. Others, they're totally locked down. Kind of up and down, but they have the talent to where they'll probably have a top 10 defense this year, and especially if they're healthy. Offensively is where they have questions. I personally think the O-line as the year goes on will be fine. I think receiver and quarterback and Denbrock probably not having the same tools that he had at LSU are probably going to be the bigger areas of questions and concerns. Same with game management, but overall this should be one of the better teams in the country. And I guess you all have to see whether I have them in my playoff or not. It's tough picking who's going to get into the playoff. But I know that you have to depart us to go on to your show. I hope you have success with that. And thank you for coming on. I hope to see you back here soon and talk more college football.
Of course, Sam, appreciate you having me on. I'm glad that we were able to line this up and with good timing for the season right around the corner. But again, appreciate you, and I'm sure that we're going to connect again soon.
All right. Awesome, Joe. Have a great day, and I'll see you soon.
You too.
All right, everyone. Well, thank you for being incredibly patient with me and also for, tuning in. 20 concurrent viewers, 5 likes. I am going to take a very brief break, and then we're going to get right back on and talk about who I think some of college football's best defenses will be. I will see you guys very soon. All right, everyone. We're back. Again, thank you for tuning on in. If you have any super chats, any questions that you have, comment them, and now as I'm drinking water and catching my breath will be a good time to answer. But very quickly, we're going to get right back in to talking about the best defenses in college football. Because I have a few of them that I want to get to. Check out my Michigan-themed mug, too. Go Blue. Okay. So, entering the 2024 season, something that I have found very fascinating when looking at depth charts and studying different teams is I feel like the strength of defenses this year outmatches the strength of offenses by a wide margin. Very wide margin. And I could be wrong on that. I think part of it, from my perspective, is the fact that I think the quarterbacks at the top of college football this year are going to be down. For example, Dylan Gabriel, he was top 5 last year in quarterback efficiency, but that measures efficiency and how well you perform on an average basis, which also means it takes into account your performance against bad teams. Dylan Gabriel, for example, had elite numbers against bad or mediocre teams. Against good teams, he got a little worse. He didn't perform as well as Bo Nix, Jaden Daniels, J.J. McCarthy in big games. He didn't do as well as Michael Penix did in big games. I would say he wasn't as good of a quarterback as Caleb Williams, for example. So there's a lot that goes into QBR. And Gabriel, I think, is right now a top 3 quarterback, definitely top 4. Jalen Milroe is a quarterback who's up there too right now, and last year he struggled passing the football, even toward the end of the season when he improved. Carson Beck, there's a strong case for him to be number 1. Those are some of your better quarterbacks right now. There isn't a generationally gifted QB like Caleb Williams, maybe Shedeur Sanders if you're purely looking at NFL build, but he has to prove it on the field, and he hasn't done that yet like Caleb Williams has. There's not someone who looks to be like a Bo Nix or Jaden Daniels, even though Jaden Daniels and Bo Nix surprised much of the college football world with their success. So I think a lot goes into how offenses this year are going to take a step back. Defenses might actually take a step forward, if not stay the same. And I'm going to continue to explain why I believe that is in a minute. But before we do that, DC the Gentleman with a $2 super chat. Thank you very much, DC the Gentleman, for your $2 super chat. Just for simplicity, especially since I expect these live streams to get more popular, now that everything's set up and the season is going to be in full swing fairly shortly, I just thought it'd be smart to switch to only super chats, because that makes my life easier. And it's hard to answer every comment, unfortunately, because of all the fans that we have. Okay, let's go here for Utah's top 5 spot. Just in general, you think Utah's going to be a top 5 team? Or do you think that you're just talking about them having a top 5 defense, since that's the topic that we're going to be talking about up here next? I honestly... Utah being top 5 in seeding isn't bold, because if you just win the Big 12 and only have 1, maybe 2 losses, you're going to be in as a top 4 seed with an auto bye, and Utah, I think, should be favored to win the Big 12. But if you're talking about like a top 5 team overall, DC the Gentleman, that is a very bold prediction. But thank you for the $2 super chat. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. All right, so who are the best defenses in college football? Well, I think that the Big Ten is going to dominate that conversation. Penn State, Iowa, Michigan, and Ohio State were arguably all top 4 defenses last season. Iowa and Ohio State return more than half of their production from the prior year, and the bulk of their starters. Penn State and Michigan bring back a respectable amount, actually also more than half of their production on the defensive side of the ball as well. Michigan's hovering at around half. Penn State is closer to 2/3. Same with Ohio State, and Iowa is just up there in returning production. And Tom Allen is Penn State's new defensive coordinator. He should do well. Wink Martindale at Michigan, their new defensive coordinator, is an NFL pedigree. And Jim Knowles and especially Phil Parker have proven themselves to be some of the best college football minds, not just defensive minds, but college football minds in the country. You always have to look out for Georgia with Kirby Smart and the way that they recruit, having Muschamp as an analyst, Glenn Schumann as their longtime defensive coordinator. They brought in Tavarius Robinson from Alabama to be their secondary coach. And I just really like the talent they have. As I was talking with Joe earlier today, they're set up for success this year, and they should be better on the defensive side of the ball. Oh, Travaris Robinson from Georgia. Correction on that. But they should be good defensively, and more than good. They should return perhaps to the elite of college football on the defensive side of the football. You have to watch out for Florida State as well, who returns a lot from their defense, brings in some transfers. They, last year, had one of college football's better defenses, particularly in the passing game department, before much of their roster opted out and they got destroyed by Georgia. There are some other teams, too, in Notre Dame, Utah. Even got to look out for Iowa State, Oregon. They've rightfully been in many top 10 preseason lists for defense. There's also Nebraska, who you have to pay attention to. I apologize if my dog is barking. This is something that's annoying about streaming from home, by the way. Tonight's show has had so many errors, but we push on. That's what we do, and I will edit a lot of this out for the reruns that we do. So again, thank you for your patience and everything. Okay, but again, we fight on. We continue, and my dog just stopped barking, but I closed out of something. So hold on, guys. All right, we're back. So college football's best defenses. I think that you have Utah, Notre Dame, you have Nebraska, Clemson, Oklahoma, Georgia, Florida State, Penn State, Iowa, Michigan, Ohio State, Oregon, maybe even Iowa State can come on here. You never know. But what I want to talk to you about today are 6 teams that I think are the most likely to be the best defense in college football. Teams that have elite defensive coordinators and support staff that are deep in all 3 positions. Defenses that do not have weaknesses, at least obvious ones. Rather, they have weak links. They're only a weakness in relativity to the other elite positions that make up their defense. So let's take Iowa, for example. Their secondary is so good that the defensive line is a weakness on that team, despite the fact that their defensive line, their starting 4, is probably one of the best in the country. But it is not number 1. It may not even be top 5 or top 10 in college football. Their defensive line maybe not. But their secondary is definitely a top 5 unit when you look at Sebastian Castro, Xavier Nwampka, when you look at Quinn Schulte. Cooper DeJean is gone, but they'll replace him with Deshaun Lee or Jermani Harris. And with Phil Parker as their defensive coordinator, just all things constant. And what we've seen from him and him being the best mind in football, I think that it's a guarantee that Iowa's going to be in the running for being one of the better defenses in the country. And as I've already said, they fit the bill. There are 5 other defenses, perhaps more, but I really want to focus on these 6 teams that I think fit that bill of being great, near elite or elite at every position, having one of the top defensive coordinators in college football, and having some type of returning talent or NFL talent or returning experience that can give them an extra edge. I want to start out with Florida State. Florida State was snubbed from the college football playoff last year. Let's just be honest about that. But what's done is done. We can't go back and change the past, and I don't think the invention of a time machine will ever work. But that's not talking about college football. What is college football? What is factual is the fact that this was one of the best pass defenses in the country last year. They only allowed 14.3 completions per game. Opponents completed less than 50% of their passes on this Florida State secondary. And Florida State sacked opponents 3.1 times per game. And they return players like Patrick Payton, who could be an All-American this year. He had almost 15 tackles for loss. Darrell Jackson Jr. and Joshua Farmer should make up a great interior defensive tackle room. Marvin Jones Jr. is transferring in from Georgia. We'll see how he works in with this scheme, how he is utilized, but highly recruited at Georgia, upper-level 4-star, 5-star talent, a blue chipper, and with Patrick Payton on the other side, he should be able to wreak havoc on defenses, on opposing offensive tackle rooms. At linebacker, we have DJ Lundy, who is a returning contributor, an incoming Auburn transfer, Cam Riley. And at the secondary, Azariah Thomas and Fentrell Cypress II make up one of the best cornerback duos, starting cornerback duos in all of college football. Devontae Brown, Shaheem Brown, and Earl Little Jr. Those are the safeties / nickelbacks. Buck is a linebacker safety hybrid. That is the position that Devontae Brown occupies. Free safety is Shaheem Brown, and Earl Little Jr., an incoming transfer from Alabama, is the nickelback of this team. Last year, Florida State was top 25 in multiple categories, and before their Orange Bowl loss to Georgia, they were top 10 in multiple categories. Florida State last year only allowed 18.2 opponent offensive points per game. That was 13th nationally. They were 16th in opponent points per play, 23rd in opponent yards per play, and they were outside of the top 100 in takeaways. They didn't have a Michigan or Penn State or Clemson type defense taking away the ball multiple times and giving their offenses constant drives to try and feed off of. Clemson failing at that, Penn State also failing at that, Michigan being really the only offense to capitalize on their defense's success at creating takeaways. Florida State's offense created really only 1 takeaway per game, occasionally 2, which isn't that much. But they were impressive, again, at defending the pass. Their weakness was in stopping the run. They allowed 4.2 yards per carry, which was outside the top 50. Opponents ran on them for 36.5 average attempts per game and gained about 150 yards, 152.9 exactly. They returned 57% of the production from the 2023 unit, the 2024 Seminoles do, and I think their best players are defensive tackle Joshua Farmer, defensive end Patrick Payton, cornerback Azariah Thomas, and cornerback Fentrell Cypress II. Farmer and Payton had more than 5 sacks each, at least 1 forced fumble, and at least 7 tackles for loss. Patrick Payton having 14.5 tackles for loss, which is incredibly impressive. Thomas and Cypress had double digits in total tackles, Thomas with 29, Cypress with 40. They each had at least a tackle for loss or more. Cypress had 8 passes defended and a forced fumble. Thomas had 10 passes defended and a forced fumble as well. These defenders are aggressive. they are mean and they're well coached. And while they didn't have many interceptions last year or that many fumble recoveries either, they are stout. And Florida State last year had a very bend but don't break defense. And you see that with the fact that they were 31st in opponent yards per game, giving up about 340.2 yards per game, but they only gave up 18.2 offensive points per game. And they played not just an ACC schedule, which some will say, well, that's why they did so well, Sam. They shut down Jaden Daniels and LSU. They held them to 2 fourth down failures inside the 10. They had 2 goal line stops against that awesome LSU offense. They did very well against Louisville without Jordan Travis and also without Tate Rodemaker, who was suffering a head injury, and Travis was out for the season by then. They did a respectable job against Florida on defense. And if they didn't opt out against Georgia, they could have done some damage, I think, against Georgia's offense, but we'll never know that. Case in point, Florida State, pay attention to them. Do not overlook them. They may have the best, and definitely will have one of the best defenses in college football. Mike Norvell is getting his team better and better and more equipped for the SEC or the Big Ten if they go there, or just more equipped to face them when they inevitably will have to if they want to win a national championship. They're getting more talented every year, tougher every year, more athletic every year. And I'll talk about their offense at some point as well. Not in this video, but their defense, it's legit. Up next, we have Georgia. Georgia is interesting. And I say interesting because I have not seen a single person rank them as the best defense in college football for 2024. But in 2021, they had the country's best defense by a mile. In 2022, I can't exactly remember if they were up there. They were not number 1 in points per game or points allowed per game like they were in 2021. They were 5th, 4th, but they were pretty close. And they had to face an LSU offense in the SEC championship game that was good. They played a top 2 offense in Tennessee that was right up there with Ohio State that year, and they held them to 13 points. They were able to limit Ohio State's offense in one of the best games that I've ever seen Ryan Day call, and one of the best games I've ever seen Ohio State play. They were able to limit it to only 3 points in the fourth quarter after Ohio State gouged them with 38 points in 3 quarters. And that was an Ohio State offense that matched up incredibly well with that Georgia defense, who in 21 and 22 was much stronger up front than they were in the secondary. Last year was a little bit of the opposite, though. They were strong at defending the pass, especially with their defensive backs. But up front, they struggled to get pressure, and they struggled to stop the run at times, too, being gouged by Alabama and Auburn in the ground attack, respectively. Their starters for this season are projected to be Micah Williams at defensive end, Nazir Stackhouse and Warren Brinson at defensive tackle, Chaz Chambliss in this hybrid jack position. He can be a defensive end, or he can function sort of as a linebacker. Smile Munden Jr. and C.J. Allen at linebacker, Dalen Everett and Julian Humphrey at corner, Malachi Starks and Dan Jackson at safety. Starks is strong safety, Jackson is free safety, respectively, and Jonel Aguero at nickelback. This defense last year was not at the same caliber as their 21 or 22 defenses, but it was still one of the country's best. They were 7th in opponent offensive points per game, only allowing 16.5. They were 8th in opponent points per play, allowing 0.261 points per play. They allowed 291.3 opponent yards per game. Again, 8th in the country. They were 10th in opponent yards per play, allowing 4.7 yards per play. They were tied with Florida State, only forcing 1.2 takeaways per game, 104th. So they didn't give their offense time and time again opportunities to score, and yet that offense was still one of the best in college football. It was very impressive, the job that Mike Bobo did, and also the system and the caliber of offense that Todd Monken left behind. Georgia returned 61% of their production from their 2023 defense. It's 61st nationally. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but trust me, for Georgia, it is. That is a lot for Georgia. Absolutely. Given all the 5 stars they bring back, all the 4 stars, some 3 stars that they've developed rather nicely, and the fact that their area of weakness, their question mark, their weak link, as I said, to qualify for the teams that I'm talking about, for these defenses, your weak link, your weakness would be a strong point on most other defenses, and that's Georgia's rushing defense. They allowed 3.7 yards per carry, which was outside of the top 25. Opponents ran at them 30.2 tries per game on average, and they allowed 112.2 yards per game on the ground. Those are weak numbers, bad numbers by Kirby Smart and Georgia standards, but at many other schools, that would be something to be applauded for. If you are Kentucky, if you are Arkansas, heck, even if you are, let's say, Missouri, if you are Texas A&M, if you are LSU compared to last year's defense for sure, you'd be pleased with those numbers. For Georgia, not so much. And their run defense killed them against Alabama. It nearly killed them against Auburn, the same team who got blown out by New Mexico State, but then competed with and nearly beat both Georgia and Alabama. It's just what Jordan Hare does. It's also what Hugh Freeze does. He's a genius against top 10 opponents and then finds a way to lose to Memphis or Vanderbilt or Arkansas and now New Mexico State. My favorite players and the best players on this Georgia defense are Mykel Williams, Smile Munden Jr., Dalen Everett, and Malachi Starks. Mykel Williams had 4.5 sacks and 6.5 tackles for loss last year, and that was him being involved in a rotation, a big-time rotation. Smile Munden Jr. had 5 tackles for loss, 3 sacks, a pass defended, and nearly 70 total tackles. And Everett and Starks combined had 12 passes defended, 4 interceptions, 3 tackles for loss, and 81 total tackles. The secondary is an area with some questions, as Dan Jackson, Jonell, Aguero, and Julian Humphrey are some newer players. Tyke Smith left the program along with some other players. All of them went off to the NFL. But I think that this unit, even with their losses at secondary, they return a lot on their front. It's the reason why Jamin Dumas-Johnson left for Kentucky. He got hurt, and he knew that he would not be a guaranteed starter because the depth at linebacker with Munden Jr., with C.J. Allen, with some of the backups that they have, is just absolutely incredible. Georgia leads the SEC in my all-SEC teams, which I will release when I showcase my SEC predictions in a video. They have over 20 players on that list, and Jalen Walker is another player to pay attention to in that linebacker room. And I think that Georgia, they may not be the best in the country on defense this year, maybe not, but they can certainly contend to be that number 1 defense. And with the offense that they have, that's all that matters. They're definitely going to be a superior defensive unit compared to what they were last year, and I think they are in this category. They may be college football's best defense. With Iowa, I'm more confident in saying that Iowa is going to be, or at least in that category of being college football's best defense. In fact, I made a video, a 20-minute video, talking about why I think Iowa will have college football's best defense. But that doesn't mean they're perfect. Something that they don't have, that Georgia, Florida State, and really every other team on this list has, is an abundance of blue chip talent. Now, I'm someone who thinks that recruiting in the modern age of college football is overrated, but it is still incredibly valuable. On the defensive line, Iowa will start Deontay Craig and Ethan Hurkett at defensive end, Aaron Graves and Yaya Black at defensive tackle, Nick Jackson and Jay Higgins at linebacker. Sebastian Castro occupies that cash hybrid safety corner linebacker position. John Nestor and Germani Harris are in the cornerback rooms. I think I said Deshaun Lee earlier for Iowa. Deshaun Lee, I think, transferred away now that I remember, and isn't even in college football anymore. So correction there. Safeties are Xavier Nwampka and Quinn Schulte. Nwampka is in the strong safety position. Schulte is in the free safety position. They bring back 86% of their production from 2023 on defense. It's crazy. They were first in opponent yards per play, only allowing 3.9 yards per play. And this was with an offense that was outside the top 130 in scoring. This may have been the best defense in college football last year, but because of how atrocious their offense was, you would never know it. They only allowed 13.7 opponent offensive points per game, which was third, 0.207 points per play, again third, and they were fifth in opponent yards per game, only allowing 281.9 yards per game. Some of this is also puffed up due to the fact that they did not play great offenses. In fact, they played pretty terrible offenses outside of Penn State, Michigan, and Tennessee. Michigan and Tennessee were by a mile the best offenses they played all season. Even Iowa State is up there in terms of the caliber of offenses that Iowa played last year compared to the average offense they faced. And when they played Tennessee, it showed. When they played Michigan, Michigan played one of their worst games on offense I had seen in a while. Their O-line played like garbage, frankly. They were still able to hang some points and make some moves on Iowa without doing much. And Penn State just wrecked them. So there is an argument for this not being the best defense in college football. But those are very weak arguments, in my opinion. Iowa, their passing defense, they allowed a 56.14 completion percentage from their opponents, and they led the country in yards allowed per completion. Every time an opponent completed a pass, on average, it was only 9 yards. That's very impressive. In second place was Ohio State in that category, allowing 9.7 yards per completion. Only, I think, those two teams, maybe another team, per completion they allowed less than first down in yardage. That's very impressive. And teams had so many plays against Iowa because Iowa's offense would just 3 and out. Would you like another 3 and out? Punt, punt, punt. The only criticism I have of this team is their takeaways per game. They only had 1.1 takeaways per game, which was 111th in the nation last year. And as a result of their bad offense and not creating many turnovers on defense, they had a -0.5 turnover margin per game. That's something that I know Phil Parker will improve upon entering 2024 because his defenses are known for intercepting opponent quarterbacks and creating turnovers. It's like Georgia with their defense in general, especially their talent up front and at linebacker with Kirby Smart. You know, after a year like last year, he's going to look at their weaknesses, and with Travaris Robinson and with Glenn Schumann, they're going to dissect those weaknesses and fix them. Phil Parker is that good. He is the nation's #1 defensive coordinator, and that's more certain than Iowa being the best defense in the country. The best players are all in the back 7 for Iowa. Their defensive linemen, don't get me wrong, are very good. Some are even of All-American caliber, perhaps in my opinion. But Nick Jackson, Jay Higgins, Sebastian Castro, and Quinn Schulte, those are certainly elite players, All-Americans in their own right. Nick Jackson and Jay Higgins each had over 100 total tackles last year. Jay Higgins had 171. Jackson had 8 tackles for loss, 4 sacks, 2 forced fumbles. Higgins had 5 tackles for loss, 2 sacks, an interception. Sebastian Castro had 8 tackles for loss, 8 passes defended, and 3 picks in that secondary cash position with 67 total tackles as well. Quinn Schulte had 4 passes defended, a pick, 2.5 tackles for loss. This secondary, while losing Cooper DeJean, will still be one of the best in all of college football. The linebacker group, especially the starting group, is by far the #1 linebacker core in college football. It just is. It may be the best room on defense, like factoring in the starters per unit. Linebacker will typically have less starters than the defensive line or the secondary especially. When you factor all of that in, Nick Jackson and Jay Higgins may make up the best starting unit on defense in the country. That's how good they are. And that is factoring in Ohio State's secondary, Michigan's defensive line, and other schools that are elite at multiple positions on the defensive side of the football. Pay attention to Iowa, especially in the regard to their offense. If their offense can control the clock more efficiently and at least put up one more touchdown per game, maybe 10 more points per game, or heck, if Drew Stevens is more accurate this year and maybe kicks an extra field goal per game and occasionally you turn one of his field goals into a touchdown, this defense will be infinitely more efficient because they can be more aggressive. They can afford to try and take the ball away more or try and get the sack instead of being super conservative, because with one mistake, the can of worms is open and you get an L instead of a W, like what happened against Minnesota last year for the Hawkeyes. And yeah, I mean, that defense did an admirable job, an exceptional job with the circumstances they were placed in. Michigan is up next. The Michigan Wolverines had college football's #1 defense last year. The problem is they lose nearly half of their production from 2023. And ultimately, with Iowa returning as much as they do, Florida State, Georgia, and then some other teams on this list returning what they do, Michigan could easily fall behind. 24/7 Sports projected them to be the #1 defense in all of college football entering 2024, but many others say it's going to be Ohio State or Iowa. And it's really those two, particularly Ohio State, who's ahead of Michigan. But here's why Michigan can still have the #1 defense, one of the best in college football, even with all they replace, both staff-wise and roster-wise. Their defensive line, with Josiah Stewart and Derek Moore on the edge, with Kenneth Grant and Mason Graham on the interior, might be the best in college football. Not just in terms of starting 4, but even the 2 deep. So in that case, the rotational 8. Rayshon Benny is one of the better defensive tackles in the Big Ten, and he's a 3rd stringer. Noah Etta is a player who could be in the rotation and make a big impact, and defensive end is thinner, but Josiah Stewart and Derek Moore were very productive last year, and Michigan has recruited well on their defensive front. And Ernest Hausman, an incoming transfer from Maryland, Jashawn Barham, they make up a great linebacker duo, replacing the outgoing Michael Barrett and Junior Colson, who both left for NFL aspirations, and I wish them well there. Michigan was #1 in offensive points per game allowed, only allowing 10.5. They were #1 in opponent points per play, allowing 0.173 points per play. They were #1 in yards per game allowed, only allowing 247.1. They were 4th in opponent yards per play, 4.1. They were top 20 in takeaways per game. They on average forced 2 turnovers per game. And of that defense, they bring back 53% of their production. And Kenneth Grant, Mason Graham, Derek Moore, and Josiah Stewart were at the minimum rotational players last year. Mason Graham was a starter. Hausman was a rotational player. Barham is an incoming transfer and starter for Maryland. Makari Page was a starting safety at Michigan last year, strong safety. Quentin Johnson was a rotational free safety. Will Johnson was the starting cornerback at Michigan, the best cornerback on the team, the anchor of that secondary. He's back. The bigger questions for Michigan are really Jair Hill at left cornerback opposite of Will Johnson. He's a redshirt freshman. And Jaden McBurrows, who's been with the program for a while, is projected to start at nickelback, but he couldn't win the starting cornerback job last year. They had to bring in Josh Wallace from UMass, who was great for Michigan last year, but we'll have to see if they can step up in the secondary. Michigan will be strong at defending the run. Last year, they only allowed 90.1 yards per game on the ground, only allowing 3.0 yards per opponent carry on about an average of 30 attempts per game. The weakness of this team really is the experience and depth. They lost a ton, a lot. They even lost some guys to the portal in the secondary and at linebacker. They did. The defensive line is the strength and will be the anchor of this defense. The secondary, there's some questions, and linebacker isn't as strong as the defensive line. If there was an area outside of experience and production that I'd say is maybe a question for this team, it's the secondary. That is with Quentin Johnson, Makari Page, Will Johnson, incoming transfer Wesley Walker, Amir Hall. The secondary is deep. And like I said, Michigan is strong at every position, just like every defense we're talking about, but that is a point of weakness for this defense. It's an area that could be weaker and likely will be compared to linebacker, and is definitely weaker than the defensive line. The best players on this team are Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, Josiah Stewart, all on the defensive line, and cornerback Will Johnson. Grant, Graham, and Johnson are all projected to be first-round picks for the 2025 NFL Draft. Graham had 7.5 tackles for loss, 3 sacks, and a forced fumble. Kenneth Grant had 5 tackles for loss, 3.5 sacks, and 4 passes defended. Will Johnson had 27 total tackles, a tackle for loss, 4 picks, and 4 interceptions, including 1 returned for 6. Michigan's defense will probably be more aggressive with Wink Martindale as their defensive coordinator now. They will blitz more, they will send more pressure looks, but overall it will be a similar defense schematically to what Mike McDonald and Jesse Minner had going on at Michigan, that Ravens-style defense, who Martindale was the architect of. So Michigan, for sure, even losing what they do, not just on the roster, but especially their coaches. They lost Chris Partridge, who was fired in the middle of last year due to not complying with NCAA rules and investigations. He's replaced by Brian Jean Marie. At defensive back, they lost Steve Klinkscale, who followed Jim Harbaugh, and they replaced him with Lamar Morgan from Louisiana. On the defensive line, they replaced Mike Elston, who again followed Jim Harbaugh, originally with Greg Scruggs. Then the driving and alcohol incident happened. I forget if it was operating under the influence or driving under the influence, because that's 2 different terminologies, but something happened there. And then Michigan brought in Lou Esposito from West Virginia last year, and he was briefly at Memphis this preseason. That's a lot of change that's happened. But overall, with the scheme being similar and the amount of studs on this defense, it's up there with Florida State, with Georgia, with Iowa, and also with Ohio State. Ohio State's defense right now, per the average analyst's opinion on this, the average graphics that I see on Twitter, the average video I watch on YouTube, they're the favorite to have the number 1 defense in college football. And why not? Jim Knowles proved last year that he is one of college football's best defensive coordinators and one of the best defensive coordinators in the Big Ten, which is the Conference of Defense. And he brings back nearly 70% of last year's production on the defensive side of the ball, where Ohio State was second, only behind Michigan, in offensive points per game allowed, points per play allowed, and yards per game allowed. They only allowed 11.7 points per game on offense, not counting pick sixes or anything like that. They only allowed 0.175 opponent points per play, and they only allowed 268.3 opponent yards per game, and they were third in opponent yards per play, only behind Michigan and Penn State, where they only allowed 4.1 yards gained per play per opponent play. And this is the worst defense we've talked about so far in terms of takeaways per game. Ohio State didn't even average 1 takeaway per game. And it's not like Kyle McCord or Travion Henderson or Marvin Harrison Jr., Ibuka, Mayan Williams, DeMonte Traynham, Chip Traynham. It's not like they were the safest offense with the ball. They weren't, and they even had some special teams gaffes in that area, which didn't help the offense maximize their possessions, and it didn't help keep the defense off the field. But they bring back so much, and I think last year for Jim Knowles may have been a little bit of an overreaction to the prior season, where the defense was super aggressive, but then you saw the cracks against Penn State where they were able to exploit some weaknesses in the secondary, and even with Ohio State constantly sending blitzes, they were able to keep them honest in the ground game. And then Michigan and Georgia just blew that defense wide open. And statistically, it looked about as bad as the 2021 defense, despite being very much improved. Last year, this defense was very conservative. In fact, I saw Michigan, who didn't then, and I don't know if they necessarily will now, even though Martindale's more blitz happy than Minter is. Last year, Michigan sent more pressure consistently, not just being more effective at getting the sack, which they were, but they sent more guys forward more often than Ohio State did. Ohio State occasionally sent 0 blitzes, or they sent more guys forward, more than the traditional 4. But they were very conservative. And you see that in their play style, and also in the fact that they were second in both yards allowed per game and points allowed per game, but they allowed 268.3 yards per game and barely over 10 points. That's crazy. And they did that without collecting many takeaways. And you also see it in the 4th down conversions allowed per game. Ohio State was near the bottom in 4th down conversions allowed, and it wasn't just because of the Michigan game, but some other games as well, where especially in short yardage, Ohio State struggled on defense. Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau will be the starting defensive ends. Ty Hamilton and Tyleik Williams are projected to be the starting defensive tackles. This is one of the best defensive lines in the nation, much like Michigan's. At linebacker, C.J. Hicks is projected to be a breakout player by many, will be a new starter this year after not seeing much playing time last year, and longtime Buckeye Cody Simon will also start, likely at middle linebacker. Denzel Burke and Davison Igbinosun, potentially Jordan Hancock. Corner is their natural position, though Jordan Hancock will be at nickelback projected this season. Igbinosun and Burke will be the corners. Lathan Ransom will be starting strong safety yet again, and Caleb Downs, incoming transfer from Alabama, will be the starting free safety. Downs is one of the best players in the country, one of the best DBs in the country, like Will Johnson, like Sebastian Castro, like Dalen Everett. And the best players on this defense are either up front on the D-line or at secondary. Ohio State, in my opinion, has the best secondary in the country, and at the very worst, one of the best secondaries. Their position of weakness is at linebacker. And overall for the team, I think it's game control. They allowed 7 first downs per game last year on average, just from opponents running the football. And I remember that drive from Michigan, where Michigan milked nearly 8 minutes off the clock in the 4th quarter, kicked a field goal, and McCord and the offense were rushed to get down the field and score a touchdown. And Michigan, Rod Moore specifically, picks off Kyle McCord. Game over. I remember the drive where Michigan had 2 4th down conversions on Ohio State's defense. Penn State, they didn't run that well against Ohio State. And that was only because they chose to pass a ton against the Buckeyes. There were multiple opportunities for Penn State where if they just ran the ball, they would have been in a better position to win and perhaps would have won in Columbus for the first time under James Franklin. And against Notre Dame came back from a 10-0 deficit and nearly won, if not for some of their own ineptitude, whether that's on Gerard Parker or Marcus Freeman, Al Golden, or all 3 of them combined. Notre Dame came back from that deficit, was running the ball very well, keeping Ohio State's defense honest, and also taking advantage of how conservative they were and driving down the field late in the game to score touchdowns. So that's an area to look at of a weak link or something where Jim Knowles, you'd expect him to improve upon that this season, but it's a lot like every other defense we've talked about on this list. It's just a weak link in comparison to how great every other player, position / coach on this side of the ball is. The passing defense, when you only allow 5 yards per pass attempt on 30 total attempts and less than 150 passing yards per game, Ohio State was first in passing yards allowed per game, and I believe passing yards per attempt allowed. You have one of the better secondaries in the country. And that's factoring in Ohio State playing Missouri, playing Michigan, playing Notre Dame when Sam Hartman was still hot and before Mitchell Evans was injured. That passing defense was legit. It would have shut down any passing offense in the country, except for maybe Washington's or maybe Oregon's if they were having a very good day. Tyleik Williams and Jack Sawyer, and then Denzel Burke and Caleb Downs, those I think are the 4 best players on this defense. Williams and Sawyer both had 10 tackles for loss. Williams also had 3 sacks and 5 passes defended. Sawyer had 6.5 sacks in a big game against Missouri in the Cotton Bowl. Denzel Burke had 3 tackles for loss, 9 passes defended, and a pick. Free safety Caleb Downs coming in from Alabama. He had 107 total tackles last year, 3.5 tackles for loss, 4 passes defended, and 2 interceptions. So, up front, on the D-line, and on the secondary, yeah, this defense is legit. Linebacker, and consequentially, especially since Jim Knowles likes to use wide gap techniques, linebacker is an area that must be good, and I think it will be. Elite may even be necessary if this defense wants to be the best in college football. We've seen Ohio State and how their defense has functioned under Knowles and also the prior regime of Kerry Coombs when they do not have strong gap integrity. They get gashed. They absolutely do, and I think that's part of the reason why Jim Knowles went so conservative last year. And to a certain degree, it paid off. Ohio State was near the top of football in big plays allowed. But ultimately, it did cost them somewhat in being able to manage the clock and control games against bigger opponents who could go toe-to-toe with them on both offense and defense, and also taking advantage of Ohio State's poor special teams. Look out for the Buckeyes. I think all of you are. I don't think anyone is going to overlook this unit. But don't be surprised, even with their tougher schedule, if they're only allowing barely over 10 points per game, and in some cases winning games against Oregon or Penn State or Michigan. And in particular, let's say Iowa or Nebraska, some other elite defenses, they're winning defensive brawls and just dominating with defense, especially if they fix the turnovers and get a little more aggressive. That will help out this defense a lot, in my opinion. And we have Penn State. Penn State fascinates me on defense because they lose Manny Diaz. But Manny Diaz, I don't think, was the same caliber of defensive coordinator. Perhaps I'm still wrong on this, but given what he did against Michigan, some of what he did against Ohio State last year, and especially that Indiana game where Indiana just had this weird flukish performance where they were very successful against Penn State in the passing game department. Brennan Sorsby at one point was averaging nearly 20 yards per pass attempt. It was insane. He wasn't the same caliber of DC as Phil Parker, as Jesse Minner, as Jim Knowles, not the same as Glenn Schumann or many other defensive coordinators around the country, like Brent Venables at Clemson, for example, when he was at Clemson, not at Oklahoma. But Oklahoma, they barely missed this list, but I want to get back on topic. Penn State brought in Tom Allen. They did. Tom Allen had some success on defense at Indiana, both as the defensive coordinator, more importantly as the head coach, when in 2020 they had a top 25 defense. And in 21 and 22, they had talent on defense. The offense was just so bad that it could never be utilized. And unlike Iowa, they did not have the coaching or depth to compensate for that. Part of that was because they were in the Big Ten East and got beaten up by Ohio State, Michigan, and Penn State throughout the season. This defense is strong. And last year, again, this is what I hate about the opt-outs in bowl games. This defense may have been better than Iowa's, than Ohio State's, than Clemson's. It's just they got gashed in the Peach Bowl because Manny Diaz wasn't there, because Chop Robinson opted out. I know that their corners, Caitlin King and Johnny Dixon, opted out. And I think they had some other opt-outs too. They were playing Cam Miller and then like a true freshman at starting corner against Trey Harris and Caden Precorn and Jackson Dart. That's suicide. You're not going to use your defense to win a game with that setup. You're just not. Even factoring that in, they were fourth in offensive points allowed per game, 13.8 points per game allowed, 0.216 points per play allowed. That was fourth nationally. They only allowed 256.6 yards per game, which was third nationally. They were second in opponent yards per play, ahead of Ohio State, ahead of Michigan, only allowing 4 yards per play, only behind Iowa. And they were 11th, leading all of these teams that we've talked about in takeaways per game, especially in regards to fumbles, because they'd always get to the quarterback. Penn State's weakness, this is fascinating, was pass defense. Now, what are you telling me, Sam? They only allowed 181.6 yards per game, and they only allowed 6.1 yards per pass attempt. Those are great numbers. Well, that is true. That is true, but they allowed 11.3 yards per completion, and the only reason Penn State didn't allow more passing yards per game was because they would get to the quarterback so fast. Look what happened at Michigan. Look what happened against Iowa. Look what happened even against Ohio State. Ohio State's passing offense, despite having a huge matchup advantage with Ohio State's receivers being much better, especially Marvin Harrison Jr., than Penn State's corners, Penn State had an elite pass rush. It was the best pass rush in college football last year. And if you could not get outside leverage, especially in the ground game, you were toast. You were not going to have success against that defense without allowing Penn State's offense and James Franklin to shoot itself with a shotgun in the foot while wearing flip-flops, which is what Penn State's offense was last year. It was very unserious. That was their weakness, was their secondary. And their secondary was not bad by any stretch of the imagination. And if not for what was probably a very off game against Indiana and a ton of opt-outs against Ole Miss, it would be probably looked upon as a top 10, maybe top 5 secondary last year. You had Kalen King. You had Kevin Winston Jr., who comes back. Jalen Reed, you had him. Zakee Wheatley was in the rotation. All of these players, safety is their natural position. They'll be starting in the secondary this year. A.J. Harris comes in from Georgia. He'll be starting at right corner. Cam Miller starting at left corner. Again, these are projections, but with fall camp underway and what we know from many of these players' careers in previous seasons, we can pretty accurately gauge who the starters will be. There are plenty of players back, and Penn State returned 68% of their production on defense from 2023. Pretty good numbers. Top 40 in returning production, a top 10 in all the statistics I listed except for turnovers, which they were just one spot outside of the top 10. Their rushing defense last year was insane. If it weren't sack adjusted, they'd probably be behind Michigan, UCLA, and some of these other schools that didn't get to the quarterback as efficiently, as proven by the Michigan game at times against Ohio State, and then also against Ole Miss, though again I think more of that was due to the opt-outs than Penn State just having a problem there. Michigan especially proved that with a stacked offensive line and with commitment to the ground game, especially with outside leverage and taking advantage of Penn State's scheme of playing tight technique and loving to blitz inside and getting pressure there. Penn State's defensive tackles, for example, were better at pass rush than stopping the run. They were awesome at both, but particularly their defensive tackles were for a long time built more like defensive ends until last year when they put a little more muscle on, got more experienced, and were still great at rushing the passer. And this year, many of their defensive tackles, like 3 out of their 5 that have been in the rotation, are over 300 pounds. They have experience there. This defensive line, we talk about Michigan, we talk about Ohio State. What if Penn State has the best defensive line in all of college football? It's very possible. They only allowed 75 rushing yards per game last year, and I know this is sack adjusted, but still, you typically don't lose a ton of yards on sacks. Teams only average 2.2 yards per carry on Penn State. The only team that ran on Penn State successfully when their defense wasn't just, plagued with opt-outs and Manny Diaz leaving the program, only Michigan could successfully run on them. No one else could. West Virginia, a little bit. Ohio State also probably would have been a little bit if Henderson played in that game. That was it. The best players on this defense are Abdul Carter at defensive end. I think Donnie Dennis Sutton will have a breakout year at defensive end. And then you have linebacker Kobe King and Kevin Winston Jr., strong safety. Kevin Winston Jr. had 61 total tackles, 2.5 tackles for loss, 5 passes defended, and an interception. Abdul Carter and Donnie Dennis Sutton combined for 8 sacks, for 11.5 tackles for loss, and I think 2 or 3 forced fumbles last season. I highlighted Donnie Dennis Sutton there because, well, he had 2 of them, and also you only have limited space when a editing for these templates. But Abdul Carter was a linebacker last year. I think that he will do extremely well as a pass rush. Now at defensive end, that's the position Penn State originally wanted him to play at. He declined, and he was open to it after 2023. Kobe King, who's projected to start at middle linebacker, he had 59 total tackles last year, 6 TFLs, 1.5 sacks. Tony Roas is a true freshman, played in nearly every game for Penn State last year. He's projected to start at weak side linebacker, and he'll do well there. He's a breakout player for me as well, and definitely an all Big Ten caliber linebacker, and consequentially one of the best linebackers in all of college football. Tom Allen is a legit unit this year, and they start off playing at West Virginia, but West Virginia loses some players on their offense, and their offense was not the strength of their team last year. This defense will have several games to figure something out, given that there probably will be some changes from Diaz to Allen and some of the departures that they've had. But then again, I imagine that Tom Allen will keep things pretty similarly, and the transition from Diaz to Allen will probably be similar to the one from Minter to Martindale at Michigan. Penn State's defense should reload. In fact, this could be college football's best defense, and people might cringe at that a little bit because Penn State, while having awesome defenses under Brent Pry and especially under Manny Diaz last year, they were never quite at that number one caliber. Brent Pry never had the nation's best defense, though he was close a few times. And Manny Diaz's unit last year at some point, looked like they could contend for that. But after the Michigan game in particular, that was evident that they did have enough weak links compared to Michigan and even Iowa and Ohio State, especially by the very end of the season, that you knew they were probably not the best defense in the country. But this year, with how much they bring back, again, nearly 70% of their production from the prior year, that's a lot. Those are Ohio State numbers, and they're above Ohio State in that category, I do believe. So pay attention. Just pay attention to Penn State, really to all of these defenses. I know that for Ohio State, Michigan, and Iowa, no one's going to overlook their defense. But whether it's Penn State, with how they looked in the Peach Bowl, unlike Ohio State in the Cotton Bowl, it was not an impressive performance, or Georgia due to some of last year's slumps and hiccups, or Florida State due to the bowl game, especially those three defenses, don't overlook them. I think that these 6 defenses can be the best in all of college football. Thank you all so much for watching this episode of Touchdown Talk. And again, Florida State, Georgia, Michigan, Ohio State, Iowa, and Penn State. Those defenses, do not be surprised at all, and I know you won't be because you watched this episode, if they are the best defense, or one of them is locked down the best defense in college football. In fact, those could be the 6 best defenses in college football right there, and then there's a big drop-off after those. But you'll get to see my thoughts on who are exactly the best defenses in college football ranked. I'll do a top 10 defense in college football video that will release in about a week on the YouTube channel and also the Spotify. Thanks to Crash2488 and Brasco Rascal for being Heisman Patreon members. Thanks to Chris Lane, Conolidal OH, and Ismar for being All-American Patreon members. Thanks to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, and Janisha Cockrell for being all-conference members. Check out my Patreon page via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. And do the same with my merchandise store if you will. You can look in the description or down below in the pinned comment. It is through Threadless. They do a very good job, make the t-shirts, the sweaters very affordable. If you're a fan of a Big Ten school, you can get your school colors with a College Football with Sam themed t-shirt. So it has the College Football with Sam logo in a very comfortable material, and then your school colors. You can also get a long sleeve t-shirt, even a College Football with Sam mug, if that's your thing. Just check out the merchandise store via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. Thank you all so much for watching this stream. Touchdown Talk, as I said a few weeks ago, is back. It'll be occurring more often in the regular season. And I will see you guys all very